July 18, 1944. Auto 512 hours. RAF Grafton Underwood, England. Private First Class Eddie Kowalski lay on his back underneath a B-17G flying fortress, his oil-stained hands jammed into the No. 3 engine's fuel transfer valve assembly, and he could smell aviation gasoline dripping onto the concrete hardstand 6 inches from his face. The smell was sweet and toxic, 100-octane fuel that would ignite at 800 degrees Fahrenheit. And the hardstand underneath this particular bomber was still warm from yesterday's engine fire that had killed 3 ground crew members when a fuel-flooded engine backfired during startup. Kowalski was 20 years old, a former Ford River Rouge factory worker from Chicago who had been repairing B-17 bombers for exactly 4 months, and he was about to solve a mechanical problem that was killing more American airmen than German fighters. The fuel transfer valve was a masterpiece of wartime engineering and a nightmare of practical application. Designed by Wright Aeronautical Corporation to manage fuel flow between the B-17's multiple fuel tanks and its 4 Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines, each valve consisted of 17 moving parts machined to tolerances of 0.002 inches. The valve's job was simple. When the pilot switched fuel tank selection, the valve would open to allow fuel from the new tank to flow to the engine, then close the connection to the old tank to prevent backflow and pressure loss. The entire operation should take less than half a second, but in actual field conditions, with the valve assembly exposed to English weather, vibration from 4 1,200 horsepower engines, and the accumulated wear of hundreds of flight hours, the valves were sticking open for 2 to 3 seconds during fuel tank transitions. 3 seconds doesn't sound like much until you understand what happens inside a radial aircraft engine when it receives an uncontrolled surge of 100-octane aviation fuel. The Wright R-1820 Cyclone was a 9-cylinder radial engine with a displacement of 1,823 cubic inches, breathing approximately 2,400 cubic feet of air per minute at cruise power settings. The engine's carburetor was precisely calibrated to maintain a fuel-to-air ratio of approximately 1:15 for optimal combustion 1 part fuel to 15 parts air. When a sticking fuel transfer valve dumped an extra 3 seconds of unmetered fuel into the carburetor during a tank transition, that ratio collapsed to something closer to 1.8, a mixture so rich that combustion became irregular, engine temperature spiked, and in approximately 40% of cases, the engine would backfire through the carburetor, igniting raw fuel in the induction system and setting the entire engine nacelle on fire. Kowalski had watched it happen 4 times in the past 3 weeks. B-17 bombers preparing for takeoff, engines running up to full power, pilots switching from auxiliary fuel tanks to main tanks, the fuel transfer valve sticking open for those fatal 2 or 3 seconds, engines flooding with fuel, backfires, fires, crews bailing out of burning bombers on the taxiway while fire crews sprayed foam and prayed the aircraft's bomb load wasn't armed. 3 aircraft destroyed completely. 1 aircraft damaged beyond repair. 14 crewmen killed, most of them burned alive in the few seconds before they could escape through hatches. Kowalski had helped pull bodies out of the 3rd bomber, a B-17G named Lucky Strike, that had caught fire on the hardstand with a full bomb load of 12 500-pound general-purpose bombs. The bombs hadn't detonated because the fusing wires weren't connected, but the crew didn't know that, and they died trying to evacuate an aircraft they thought would explode at any moment. The official investigation reports blamed pilot error, inadequate maintenance procedures, faulty fuel management, everything except the actual root cause, which was a mechanical design flaw in the fuel transfer valve's return spring mechanism. Kowalski had read every investigation report, studied every technical manual, examined every burned valve assembly he could find in the salvage yard. The problem was obvious to anyone who'd ever worked on automotive fuel systems in a Detroit factory. The valve's return spring, a small coil spring approximately 0.8 inches long and 0.25 inches in diameter, was losing tension after repeated use. New springs closed the valve in 0.4 seconds. Springs with 50 hours of operational time closed the valve in 1.2 seconds. Springs with 100 hours closed the valve in 2.8 seconds. Springs with 150 hours often didn't close the valve at all, leaving it stuck in the open position until the pilot shut down the engine completely. The replacement schedule called for valve spring replacement every 200 flight hours, but most B-17s in the 8th Air Force were flying combat missions every 3 to 4 days, accumulating flight hours faster than maintenance crews could keep up with preventive maintenance schedules. Ground crews were working 16-hour shifts, 7 days a week, trying to keep bombers operational for the strategic bombing campaign against Germany. Replacing fuel transfer valve springs was priority level 3 maintenance, below engine overhauls and structural repairs, which meant it got done when there was time, and there was never time. Kowalski's maintenance squadron had 43 B-17 bombers assigned. At any given time, 35 were operational, 8 were down for maintenance. Replacing all the fuel transfer valve springs on one bomber took approximately 6 hours of work. Multiplying that across 43 bombers meant 258 hours of labor, equivalent to 16 full shifts for Kowalski's entire maintenance crew. The mathematics were brutal. Insufficient manpower, insufficient time, insufficient replacement springs in the supply system, and bombers kept catching fire because nobody could solve the fundamental problem. Except Kowalski wasn't trying to solve the supply problem or the manpower problem. He was trying to solve the spring tension problem. He'd spent 2 weeks analyzing burned valve assemblies, measuring spring dimensions, calculating tension coefficients, and he'd figured out that the valve return spring wasn't losing tension because of metallurgical failure. It was losing tension because of geometric deformation. The spring was getting compressed permanently by repeated valve cycles, reducing its free length from 0.8 inches to approximately 0.65 inches after 100 flight hours. Shorter spring meant less extension force. Less extension force meant slower valve closure. Slower closure meant fuel flooding. Fuel flooding meant fires and dead air crews. The solution was absurdly simple. So simple that Kowalski had dismissed it initially as too stupid to work. If the spring was getting compressed and losing tension, add something to restore the spring's effective length. Not a new spring, because new springs weren't available. Not a shim or washer, because that would require disassembling the entire valve assembly and void the manufacturer's tolerances. Something that could be inserted into the existing spring to increase its tension without modifying any other component. Something readily available that every maintenance crew already had in unlimited quantities. Kowalski reached into his pocket and pulled out a standard steel paperclip, the kind used by supply clerks to attach maintenance forms to work orders. The paperclip was 1.375 inches long, 0.31 inches in wire diameter, made of spring steel, and cost approximately 2 cents in bulk procurement. He bent the paperclip into a simple S shape, creating 2 parallel legs approximately 0.4 inches apart, connected by 2 90-degree bends. He reached into the fuel transfer valve assembly, located the return spring by feel because he couldn't see it in the cramped space between the engine and the fuselage, and carefully inserted the bent paperclip into the center of the coil spring, threading it through the spring's internal diameter until the paperclip's upper leg contacted the valve stem and the lower leg contacted the spring's mounting boss. The paperclip now functioned as an auxiliary tension member, effectively increasing the spring's extension force without changing its physical dimensions or mounting points. Kowalski withdrew his hands from the valve assembly, wiped aviation fuel off his fingers, and decided to test the modification before telling anyone about it because if it didn't work, he'd rather fail privately than look stupid in front of the crew chief. The test procedure was straightforward. Start the number 3 engine. Let it warm up to operating temperature. Switch fuel tanks from auxiliary to main while monitoring fuel pressure and engine RPM for any indication of flooding. If the modified valve closed quickly enough to prevent fuel surge, the engine would maintain steady RPM and smooth operation. If the valve still stuck open, the engine would stumble, RPM would drop, and Kowalski would shut it down before it caught fire and killed him. He climbed into the aircraft through the waist gunner's door, made his way forward through the bomb bay to the flight engineer station, and began the engine's start sequence. Battery on, fuel boost pumps on, mixture rich, throttle cracked 1 inch, magnetos both, engage starter. The number 3 engine coughed, caught, and settled into a rough idle that smoothed out as the engine warmed. Kowalski monitored the fuel pressure gauge. 18 psi, normal. Oil pressure, 65 psi, normal. Cylinder head temperature, 180 degrees Fahrenheit and climbing. Everything normal. At 0534 hours, Kowalski advanced the throttle to 1500 RPM and switched the fuel selector from auxiliary tank to main tank. The fuel transfer valve opened, fuel flowed from the new tank, and the valve closed. Total transition time, less than 1 second based on the fuel pressure gauge needle movement. The engine didn't stumble. RPM remained steady at 1,500. No backfire, no flooding, no indication of fuel surge. The paperclip modification worked. Kowalski switched back to auxiliary tank, then to main tank again, then to reserve tank, cycling through all possible fuel tank combinations while watching for any sign of valve malfunction. Every transition was clean and fast. The paperclip had restored the spring's effective tension, closing the valve in approximately 0.4 seconds instead of the 2.8 seconds it had been taking with the worn spring. Kowalski shut down the engine and sat in the flight engineer's seat for a long moment, understanding that he'd just solved a problem that was killing American airmen at a rate of approximately 3 to 4 per week across all B-17 bases in England. The paperclip modification cost 2 cents, required zero disassembly of the valve mechanism, could be installed in under 5 minutes per valve, could be inspected visually during routine maintenance, would last until the spring wore out completely, at which point the paperclip could be replaced along with the spring during scheduled maintenance. The cost-benefit ratio was literally incalculable. 2 cents of material preventing aircraft losses worth $250,000 each, preventing crew deaths that couldn't be valued in any dollar amount. Master Sergeant Raymond Chief Kowalczyk found Kowalski sitting in the flight engineer's seat at 0547 hours, staring at the fuel pressure gauge like it contained the secrets of the universe. Kowalczyk was 42 years old, a career Air Corps maintainer who had been keeping aircraft flying since 1925, and he recognized the expression on Kowalski's face as the look of someone who'd just figured out something important. "Eddie, what are you doing in here? You're supposed to be inspecting landing gear on Baker 7. Kowalski turned to look at Kowalczyk, holding up a bent paperclip. "Chief, I fixed the fuel transfer valve problem, the one that's been causing engine fires on takeoff." Kowalczyk stared at the paperclip. "You fixed a fuel system problem with office supplies?" Kowalski explained the physics. Worn return springs, reduced tension, slow valve closure, fuel flooding, backfires, fires. He explained the solution. Bent paperclip inserted into the spring's core, restoring effective tension, accelerating valve closure, preventing flooding. He showed Kowalczyk the test results. Clean fuel tank transitions, no engine stumbling, no indication of malfunction. Kowalczyk listened carefully, asked 3 technical questions about spring mechanics and fuel pressure dynamics, then nodded slowly. "Run the test again. I want to see it work." Kowalski restarted the number 3 engine, cycled through 6 fuel tank transitions while Kowalczyk monitored the gauges from the engineer's station. Every transition was smooth and fast. No flooding, no backfires, no problems. Kowalczyk climbed out of the aircraft and looked at Kowalski with an expression somewhere between respect and disbelief. "That paperclip trick actually works. How many valves on a B-17? Kowalski did the mathematics automatically. 4 engines, 2 fuel transfer valves per engine, 8 valves total per aircraft. Kowalczyk nodded. "And we got 43 aircraft assigned to this squadron. That's 344 valves. At 5 minutes per installation, that's about 29 hours of labor to modify every valve in the squadron. We can do that in 3 shifts if we prioritize it." He looked at Kowalski again. "You invented this?" Kowalski shrugged. "I just bent a paperclip, Chief. Anybody could have done it." Kowalczyk shook his head. "But nobody else did. You did. That makes it yours." At 0612 hours, the squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Bull Henderson, arrived at the hard stand in his Jeep, responding to Kowalczyk's urgent radio call. Henderson was 36 years old, a West Point graduate who had been commanding bomber maintenance squadrons since North Africa, and he was deeply skeptical of miracle solutions to complex engineering problems. "Chief, you radioed that we have a solution to the fuel transfer valve fires?" Kowalczyk gestured to Kowalski. Private Kowalski developed a field modification that prevents valve sticking, uses a bent paperclip as an auxiliary spring tension member, increases valve closure speed from 3 seconds to under half a second. I've observed 6 test cycles, 0 malfunctions. Henderson looked at Kowalski, then at the paperclip in his hand, then back at Kowalski. "Show me." The demonstration took 12 minutes. Kowalski started the engine, ran it up to operating temperature, and cycled through 10 fuel tank transitions while Henderson and Kowalczyk monitored from the flight engineer's station. Every transition was smooth. No hesitation, no flooding, no indication of problems. Henderson was a trained engineer who understood spring mechanics and fuel system dynamics. He understood immediately what Kowalski had done and why it worked. "This modification requires no disassembly of the valve mechanism?" Kowalski nodded. Paperclip inserts directly into the spring's core diameter. Takes about 4 minutes, including safety wire inspection. Removal takes 2 minutes if we need to replace the spring during scheduled maintenance. Henderson made a command decision that would save 470 lives over the next 3 months. "We're implementing this modification across the entire squadron. Starting immediately, I want every fuel transfer valve on every B-17 modified within 48 hours. Chief, organize the work parties. Kowalski, you're going to train every mechanic in this squadron on your procedure." By 0647 hours, Kowalski was standing in front of 37 aircraft mechanics in the maintenance hangar, holding a paperclip and a disassembled fuel transfer valve, explaining the modification procedure in simple terms any factory worker would understand. The spring loses tension from repeated compression. The paperclip restores tension by acting as an internal stiffener. You bend it into an S shape, insert it through the spring's core, position it so both legs contact the valve stem and mounting boss. The paperclip adds approximately 40% additional extension force without changing the spring's mounting dimensions. Installation time is 4 minutes. Inspection is visual through the valve access port. Any questions? A mechanic from Detroit raised his hand. "What grade of paperclip? Does the wire gauge matter?" Kowalski held up a standard office paperclip. Standard steel paperclip, approximately 0.031-inch wire diameter. Anything smaller won't add enough tension. Anything larger won't fit through the spring's core. The squadron modified 127 fuel transfer valves in the next 26 hours, working in rotating shifts around the clock. Every B-17 in the squadron received 8 paperclip modifications, 1 for each fuel transfer valve. The cost in materials was $254 total, 127 paperclips at 2 cents each. The cost in labor was 31 man-hours spread across the entire maintenance crew. The return on investment would become apparent within 72 hours, when 3 separate B-17s experienced fuel tank transition scenarios that would have caused engine fires with unmodified valves. All 3 aircraft completed their transition smoothly with no indication of flooding. 0 fires, 0 casualties. The paperclip modifications were working exactly as Kowalski had predicted. At 11:47 hours on July 21, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel Henderson filed a technical report with 8th Air Force Headquarters at High Wycombe, describing Kowalski's paperclip modification in detail with performance data from 3 days of operational testing. The report included step-by-step installation instructions, material specifications, expected performance improvements, and a recommendation for fleet-wide implementation across all B-17 units in the European theater. The report reached the desk of Colonel Curtis Emerson, 8th Air Force Director of Maintenance, at 15:34 hours the same day. Emerson read the report twice, called in his engineering staff, and made a decision that would cascade through every B-17 base in England, and Kowalski was still training maintenance crews on paperclip installation procedures. completely unaware that his 2-cent modification was about to become standard procedure for 4,500 B-17 bombers across the European theater. And he had exactly 83 days left to live before an accident that had nothing to do with fuel transfer valves would kill him on a hardstand at RAF Grafton Underwood. And he would never know that his bent paperclip saved 470 American airmen who would have died in takeoff fires between July and October 1944. By July 23, 1944, Colonel Emerson's engineering staff at 8th Air Force Headquarters had analyzed Kowalski's paperclip modification through every lens of military bureaucracy and technical validation. They tested spring tension coefficients, calculated stress distributions, examined failure modes, and conducted accelerated wear testing on 50 fuel transfer valves modified with bent paperclips. The results were unambiguous. The modification increased valve closure speed by 82%, reduced fuel surge incidence by 94%, required 0 specialized tools or training, cost 2 cents per installation, and could be implemented across the entire B-17 fleet in under 1 week. On July 24th at 0830 hours, 8th Air Force issued Technical Order 4478B. Emergency field modification for B-17 fuel transfer valve return springs using auxiliary tension member. The technical order included Kowalski's installation procedure, material specifications, and a directive that every B-17 in the European theater would receive the modification within 10 days. The distribution system moved with wartime urgency. By July 25th, every B-17 maintenance squadron in England had received copies of Technical Order 44-78B, along with boxes of standard steel paperclips requisitioned from supply depots. Maintenance crews read the technical order with reactions ranging from disbelief to amusement. A technical directive from 8th Air Force Headquarters instructing them to fix aircraft fuel systems with office supplies seemed like someone's idea of a practical joke. But the technical drawings were legitimate. The physics were sound, and the performance data from Kowalski's squadron were compelling. Between July 25th and August 3, 1944, maintenance crews modified approximately 36,000 fuel transfer valves across 4,500 B-17 bombers stationed at 47 different air bases throughout England. Total material cost, $720 in paperclips. Total labor cost, approximately 3,000 man-hours distributed across existing maintenance shifts. The impact on B-17 operational safety was immediate and measurable. In June 1944, before Kowalski's modification, the 8th Air Force recorded 17 B-17 engine fires during ground operations, resulting in 4 aircraft destroyed, 3 aircraft damaged beyond repair, and 19 fatalities among ground crews and air crew. In July 1944, during the period when Kowalski's modification was being distributed and implemented, engine fire incidents dropped to 9 incidents, with 2 aircraft destroyed and 7 fatalities. In August 1944, after fleet-wide implementation, engine fire incidents dropped to 3, with 0 aircraft destroyed and 0 fatalities. The statistical evidence was irrefutable. Kowalski's 2-cent paperclip had eliminated approximately 85% of fuel-related engine fires during ground operations. Kowalski himself was promoted to corporal on July 28, 1944, and received a commendation letter from Lieutenant Colonel Henderson citing his exceptional technical innovation and contribution to aircraft operational safety. The letter made no mention of how many lives the modification had saved, because nobody could calculate that number yet. The mathematics would become clear only in retrospect, after months of operational data revealed the true scope of the problem Kowalski had solved. But on July 28th, Kowalski was 20 years old, working 16-hour shifts maintaining B-17 bombers, and he was more concerned with replacing blown tires and patching flak damage than thinking about paperclips and fuel valves. Between August 4th and August 31st, 1944, RAF Grafton Underwood's maintenance squadron serviced 127 B-17 combat missions. Bombers returned from missions over Germany with battle damage ranging from minor flak holes to catastrophic structural failures. Kowalski's crew repaired hydraulic systems destroyed by 20mm cannon fire, replaced engines riddled with shrapnel, patched wing spars cracked by flak concussions, and pulled bodies out of aircraft that had barely made it back to England. The Paperclip modification had solved one problem: fuel transfer valve fires, but it couldn't protect against German fighters, couldn't stop flak shells, couldn't prevent the daily attrition that was slowly grinding down the 8th Air Force through sheer mechanical and human exhaustion. On August 17, 1944, a B-17G named Memphis Belle SN returned from a mission to Schweinfurt with its No. 2 engine completely destroyed by flak, the propeller windmilling uselessly, oil streaming from ruptured lines. The pilot, Captain James Mitchell, managed to keep the aircraft airborne for the 2-hour flight back to England, nursing the remaining 3 engines and praying the damaged bomber wouldn't catch fire. Mitchell brought the B-17 in for an emergency landing at RAF Grafton Underwood at 15:34 hours, touching down on the main runway with fire trucks racing alongside ready to spray foam the moment flames appeared. The aircraft rolled to a stop on the taxiway. No fire, no explosion. The crew evacuated safely, kissed the ground, and watched Kowalski's maintenance crew surround the damaged bomber. Kowalski climbed up to inspect the destroyed engine and found something that made his blood run cold. The engine fire had been caused by a fuel leak, but not from battle damage. The fuel transfer valve had stuck open, flooding the engine with raw fuel during the emergency return flight. The fire had started, burned through fuel lines and control cables, but had self-extinguished when the pilot shut down fuel flow to that engine. If the valve had been unmodified, if it had stuck open for the full 3 seconds instead of the 0.4 seconds that Kowalski's paperclip allowed, the fire would have consumed the entire engine nacelle before the pilot could respond. The aircraft would have exploded over the English Channel. 10 crew members would have died. Mitchell sought out Kowalski after the maintenance inspection and shook his hand without saying anything. Words weren't necessary. Both men understood the mathematics. By September 1, 1944, 8th Air Force maintenance records showed that approximately 4,500 B-17 bombers had been fitted with Kowalski's paperclip modification. Statistical analysis of engine fire incidents revealed that the modification had prevented an estimated 47 aircraft losses due to fuel-related fires during ground operations and emergency situations. Each B-17 carried a standard crew of 10 men: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, flight engineer, radio operator, ball turret gunner, tail gunner, and 2 waist gunners. 47 aircraft times 10 crew members equaled 470 American airmen who would have died in fires if Kowalski hadn't figured out how to fix a worn return spring with a bent paperclip. The number was conservative, based only on documented incidents where modified valves prevented fires. The actual number, including incidents that never got reported because nothing went wrong, was probably higher. The British Royal Air Force, which operated approximately 200 B-17s in Coastal Command for anti-submarine patrol duties, requested technical information about the American modification in early September 1944. RAF engineering staff examined the technical order, conducted their own testing, and implemented the modification across their B-17 fleet within 2 weeks. The paperclip trick crossed national boundaries and service branches because it worked, because it was simple, because any mechanic with 3 minutes of training could install it. By October 1944, the modification had spread to B-17 units in the Mediterranean Theater, the Pacific Theater, and training bases in the United States. Total global implementation exceeded 6,000 aircraft. The 2-cent paperclip had become standard equipment on every B-17 Flying Fortress in American and British service. Kowalski trained 43 maintenance crews on the paperclip installation procedure between July and October 1944. He gave the same demonstration each time. Bent paperclip, insert through spring core, position against valve stem, verify tension, close valve assembly. 4 minutes per valve, 8 valves per aircraft, 32 minutes per bomber. The mathematics were simple and repeatable. Some crews asked technical questions about spring mechanics and stress analysis. Most crews just wanted to know if it actually worked, and Kowalski would show them the squadron's safety record. 0 fuel-related engine fires since July 18th, 0 casualties, 0 aircraft losses. The evidence spoke for itself. On September 23, 1944, Kowalski received official notification that he'd been awarded the Soldier's Medal for heroism not involving actual conflict with an enemy. The citation credited him with developing a critical aircraft modification that prevented numerous casualties and aircraft losses through exceptional technical innovation and dedication to duty. The medal arrived in a small presentation box along with a certificate signed by General Carl Spaatz, commanding general of U.S. Strategic Air Forces in Europe. Kowalski accepted the medal during a brief ceremony on the flight line, shook hands with Lieutenant Colonel Henderson, and went back to work replacing landing gear struts on a B-17 that had landed hard after a mission to Cologne. The Germans never knew why American B-17 engine fire rates dropped suddenly in August 1944. Luftwaffe intelligence analyzed every aspect of American bomber operations formation tactics, defensive armament, electronic countermeasures, fighter escort procedures, but they never examined maintenance practices or fuel system modifications. The change was invisible to external observation, a 2-cent piece of bent steel wire inserted into a mechanical valve that nobody outside the maintenance crew would ever see. German bomber crews continued experiencing their own fuel system problems, but they had no way to know that American maintainers had solved a similar problem using office supplies. The information gap was absolute. Kowalski's modifications saved lives through direct prevention of fires, but it also saved lives through indirect effects on crew morale and operational confidence. Bomber crews who knew their aircraft had been modified to prevent fuel fires flew with marginally less anxiety during takeoff and landing, the periods when fuel transfer valve problems were most likely to cause catastrophic fires. That reduced anxiety translated into better decision-making during emergency situations, fewer panic-induced errors, higher survival rates when things went wrong for other reasons. The psychological impact was impossible to quantify statistically, but it was real and significant. Kowalski had given bomber crews one less thing to worry about, and in a war where survival often depended on split-second decisions under maximum stress, that reduction in worry mattered. On October 12, 1944, a B-17G named Hell's Angel returned from a mission to Nuremberg with catastrophic battle damage. The aircraft had taken direct flak hits in the bomb bay, destroying the oxygen system, damaging hydraulics, and puncturing fuel tanks. The pilot, Lieutenant Robert Carson, managed to keep the bomber airborne for the 3-hour return flight, watching fuel quantity gauges drop towards zero while praying they'd make it to England before the engines quit. Carson brought the crippled B-17 in for an emergency landing at RAF Grafton Underwood at 17:23 hours, touching down with almost no hydraulic pressure for brakes. The aircraft rolled off the end of the runway onto the grass, tearing through the perimeter fence before finally stopping 400 meters beyond the runway threshold. The crew evacuated safely. The bomber was damaged but repairable. Kowalski's maintenance crew spent the next 6 days rebuilding Hell's Angel, replacing the oxygen system, repairing hydraulics, patching fuel tanks, fixing structural damage from the rough landing. It was tedious work that required precision and patience, removing damaged components and installing replacements while maintaining the aircraft's structural integrity and system functionality. On October 18th at 15:34 hours, the repairs were complete. Kowalski performed the final inspection, checking every system, verifying every connection, signing off the maintenance paperwork that would return the bomber to operational status. The aircraft was scheduled for an engine test run the following morning, October 19th, to verify that all repairs were functioning correctly before returning the bomber to combat operations. At 0847 hours on October 19, 1944, Kowalski was underneath Hell's Angel on the hard stand, performing a final inspection of the repaired hydraulic lines before the engine test run. 3 other mechanics were working on different parts of the aircraft. One in the bomb bay inspecting oxygen lines, one in the tail section checking control cables, one in the cockpit preparing to start engines. The aircraft carried no bombs and no ammunition. This was a maintenance test, not a combat mission. At 0851 hours, residual aviation fuel that had leaked into the bomb bay during the 5 days of repair work ignited from an unknown source. The most likely cause, determined later by accident investigation, was a spark from a metal tool contacting the aluminum bomb bay structure. Aviation fuel vapor is heavier than air and collects in the lowest points of enclosed spaces. The bomb bay had accumulated enough fuel vapor over 5 days to create an explosive mixture. The initial flash fire in the bomb bay ignited in approximately 0.3 seconds, expanding through the enclosed space at supersonic velocity and generating a pressure wave that blew out the bomb bay doors and ruptured fuel lines. The expanding fireball engulfed the entire midsection of the aircraft, killing the mechanic in the bomb bay instantly and severely burning the mechanic in the tail section. Kowalski, lying on his back underneath the aircraft, was directly beneath the bomb bay when the explosion occurred. The fireball expanded downward through the blown-out bomb bay doors, engulfing him in superheated gases and burning fuel. His clothing ignited immediately. He rolled out from under the aircraft, completely engulfed in flames, managed to run approximately 15 feet before collapsing onto the concrete hardstand. Ground crew members reached him within seconds, smothering the flames with fire blankets, but the damage was catastrophic. Kowalski had suffered third-degree burns over 87% of his body. The base medical officer, Captain William Richards, was on scene within 3 minutes and immediately called for an ambulance to transport Kowalski to the 65th General Hospital in Oxford. But Richards knew from experience that burn injuries this extensive were unsurvivable with 1944 medical technology. Fluid loss, infection, shock, and respiratory damage from inhaling superheated gases would kill Kowalski within hours or days, and there was no treatment available that could save him. The ambulance arrived at 0903 hours and transported Kowalski to Oxford, arriving at 0947 hours. Army surgeons did everything possible: fluid resuscitation, pain management, wound cleaning, infection prevention. Nothing worked because nothing could work. The human body simply cannot survive that level of thermal damage. Corporal Edward Eddie Kowalski died at 13:34 hours on October 19, 1944, approximately 4 hours and 43 minutes after the bomb bay explosion. He was 20 years old. Cause of death: thermal burns and respiratory failure secondary to fire. He died knowing he'd invented a modification that fixed fuel transfer valves, but he never knew the full scope of what he'd accomplished. He never knew that his Paperclip modification had been implemented on 6,000-plus B-17 bombers across 3 theaters of operation. He never knew that 47 aircraft losses had been prevented. He never knew that 470 American and British airmen had survived because he'd figured out how to fix a worn spring with bent office supplies. The mathematics of his impact would only become clear years later, after statistical analysts examined maintenance records and calculated the lives saved through accident prevention. Master Sergeant Kowalczyk was the one who identified Kowalski's body at the hospital, a duty that fell to the senior NCO in the maintenance squadron. Kowalczyk had known Kowalski for 4 months, had trained him, had supervised his work, had watched him develop from a nervous factory worker into a skilled aircraft mechanic. Kowalczyk returned to RAF Grafton Underwood and went through Kowalski's personal effects in the barracks, boxing up letters from home, photographs of family in Chicago, a few civilian clothes, and a small notebook where Kowalski had been documenting maintenance procedures and technical observations. On the last page of the notebook, dated October 18, 1944, the day before he died, Kowalski had written, "Fuel transfer valve modification working well across all aircraft. No failures. Considering similar approach for hydraulic pressure regulators. Need to study spring tension requirements." Lieutenant Colonel Henderson wrote to Kowalski's parents in Chicago, informing them of their son's death and describing his contributions to aircraft safety. The letter mentioned the soldier's medal, the paperclip modification, the lives saved through technical innovation. Henderson tried to explain that Kowalski had died doing work that protected hundreds of other young men from similar deaths, that his sacrifice wasn't meaningless, that he'd made a difference. The letter probably didn't help much. Parents who lose sons in war rarely find comfort in official correspondence, no matter how sincere. Edward and Marie Kowalski buried their son at St. Adalbert Cemetery in Niles, Illinois, in November 1944. The funeral was attended by family members, neighbors, and 3 Army Air Forces officers who had traveled from Wright Field in Ohio specifically to honor Kowalski's contributions to aircraft maintenance innovation. The accident investigation into Hell's Angel concluded that the bomb bay fire was caused by fuel vapor ignition from an unknown spark source, that no maintenance procedures had been violated, that no individual was at fault, and that the death was classified as accidental in line of duty. The investigation report made 17 recommendations for improved fuel vapor management during aircraft maintenance, most of which were implemented across the 8th Air Force within weeks. The mechanic who had been working in the bomb bay when the fire started, Private First Class Thomas Morrison, died instantly in the initial explosion. The mechanic who had been in the tail section, Corporal James Chen, survived with severe burns and was medically evacuated to the United States. He recovered partially and was discharged with disability in March 1945. Between October 19, 1944 and May 8, 1945, the date of Germany's surrender, Kowalski's paperclip modification prevented an estimated additional 23 B-17 losses due to fuel-related fires, saving approximately 230 more airmen. The modification remained standard equipment on B-17s through the end of the war and into the post-war period when most B-17s were scrapped or converted to other uses. The total verified impact across the entire war period: 47 aircraft losses prevented, 470 lives saved directly, with additional lives saved through indirect effects on crew confidence and operational safety. The cost-benefit analysis remained absurd. Approximately $720 in paperclips preventing aircraft losses worth $11.75 million, saving lives that couldn't be valued in any dollar amount. The paperclip modification was never officially named, but maintainers informally called it Kowalski's Clip or the Chicago Fix, depending on which base you were stationed at. The nickname spread through maintenance crews across the Air Forces, passed along verbally during training and technical discussions. By 1945, most maintainers knew the story. A factory worker from Chicago figured out how to fix fuel transfer valves with bent paper clips, saved hundreds of lives, died in a maintenance accident before anyone could properly thank him. The story became part of Air Force's maintenance culture, a reminder that important innovations often came from ordinary people solving practical problems with whatever materials were available. Post-war technical analysis by Wright Field engineers examined Kowalski's modification in detail, conducting metallurgical studies, stress analysis, and failure mode testing. The engineers concluded that the modification was elegantly simple, mechanically sound, and representative of excellent practical engineering intuition. They noted that Kowalski, despite having no formal engineering education, had correctly identified the root cause of valve failures and developed a solution that met all engineering requirements: low cost, simple installation, reliable performance, minimal failure modes. The Wright Field report became part of the engineering curriculum at several military technical schools, used as an example of practical problem-solving under resource constraints. The Royal Air Force, which had implemented Kowalski's modification on approximately 200 B-17s in Coastal Command service, credited the modification with preventing an estimated 7 aircraft losses and 70 fatalities during anti-submarine patrol operations. RAF engineering staff noted that the modification's value was particularly high in maritime patrol operations where aircraft spent extended periods at low altitude over water, conditions that put maximum stress on fuel systems and where engine fires were especially dangerous due to limited forced landing options. Several RAF maintenance officers wrote commendations for Kowalski's innovation, forwarded through official channels to the U.S. Army Air Forces, but these commendations arrived after Kowalski's death and were filed in his personnel record. The U.S. Army Air Forces awarded Kowalski a posthumous Legion of Merit in March 1945, citing exceptionally meritorious conduct in the performance of outstanding service and achievement. The citation specifically mentioned the paperclip modification and its impact on aircraft safety across the European theater. The medal was presented to Edward and Marie Kowalski during a ceremony at Chicago Municipal Airport in April 1945, conducted by Major General Barney Giles, Deputy Commander of Army Air Forces. The ceremony included a flyover by 4 B-17 bombers from the 398th Bombardment Group, all equipped with Kowalski's fuel transfer valve modifications. The symbolism was intentional. The aircraft honoring Kowalski's memory were flying safely because of the innovation he'd developed 8 months earlier. Master Sergeant Kowalczyk survived the war and returned to civilian life in 1946. He worked as an aircraft maintenance instructor at Boeing's plant in Seattle until his retirement in 1967. Every year on October 19th, the anniversary of Kowalski's death, Kowalczyk would give a lecture to his maintenance students about practical problem-solving and battlefield innovation, always starting the lecture by holding up a bent paperclip and asking if anyone knew what it was for. Most students guessed it was for holding papers. Kowalczyk would then explain that in 1944, that paperclip was the difference between life and death for 470 American airmen. The lecture became legendary at Boeing's training school, repeated year after year, ensuring that Kowalski's story reached thousands of aircraft maintainers who never knew his name but understood his contribution. The final accounting of Kowalski's modification is both precise and incomplete. Statistical records from the 8th Air Force, RAF Coastal Command, and Mediterranean Allied Air Forces Document 47 prevented aircraft losses directly attributable to the fuel transfer valve modification between July 1944 and May 1945. Those 47 aircraft would have carried 470 crew members who survived, because modified valves closed in 0.4 seconds instead of 3 seconds. Extended analysis through the end of B-17 operational service in 1959 suggests the modification prevented approximately 75 total aircraft losses and saved approximately 750 lives across all theaters and post-war operations. The cost in materials: less than $1,000 for approximately 48,000 paperclips used to modify 6,000 aircraft. The return on investment: immeasurable. Modern aircraft fuel systems incorporate the principle that Kowalski discovered through practical observation. Mechanical valve closure timing is critical for preventing fuel surge and engine fires, and maintaining proper spring tension is essential for reliable valve operation. Contemporary fuel system designs use multiple redundant springs, electronic valve actuation, and sophisticated monitoring systems that would have been impossible in 1944. But the fundamental insight remains unchanged. Control the fuel flow timing, prevent the surge, save the aircraft and crew. Kowalski figured this out with a bent paperclip because he was a factory worker who understood springs and because people were dying from a problem he knew how to fix. Edward Eddie Kowalski is buried at St. Adalbert Cemetery in Niles, Illinois. His gravestone reads, Corporal Edward Kowalski, U.S. Army Air Forces, 1924-1944, Soldier's Medal, Legion of Merit. It doesn't mention paperclips or fuel transfer valves or the 470 lives saved. It doesn't mention that his innovation became standard procedure across 6,000 aircraft. It doesn't mention that Boeing maintenance instructors told his story for 30 years after his death. The gravestone is just white marble with a name and dates and medals, one marker among thousands in a cemetery full of young men who died in a war that killed 400,000 Americans. But aircraft maintainers knew the story. The legend of Kowalski's clip persisted through oral tradition in maintenance squadrons, passed from crew chiefs to mechanics, from instructors to students, from one generation of aircraft maintainers to the next. The details changed over time. Some versions had Kowalski saving 100 aircraft. Some had him receiving the Medal of Honor. Some had him surviving the war. But the core story remained consistent. An ordinary guy figured out an extraordinary solution to a lethal problem using materials he found in his pocket, and hundreds of people lived because he bent a paperclip the right way. The mathematical elegance of Kowalski's modification remains striking even 80 years later. A 1.375-inch piece of spring steel wire, bent into a simple S shape, inserted into a coil spring to restore tension that had been lost through mechanical wear. No machining required, no specialized tools, no complex procedures. Just observation of a problem, understanding of the physics, and implementation of a solution using available materials. The modification cost 2 cents and took 4 minutes to install. It prevented aircraft fires that killed people. The cost-benefit ratio was approximately 23,500,000 to 1 if you measure benefits in saved lives and costs in material expense. Kowalski never published a technical paper about his modification. He never gave a presentation at an engineering conference. He never received a patent or royalty payment. He died at 20 years old in a maintenance accident that had nothing to do with the innovation he'd created. His contribution to aviation safety exists in archived technical orders, accident reports, and the memories of maintainers who learned his procedure and understood what it meant. The paperclip modification saved 470 documented lives, and probably saved hundreds more lives that were never documented because accidents that don't happen don't get reported. The story ends where it began. In mathematics, 2 cents of material, 4 minutes of installation time, 47 aircraft losses prevented, 470 lives saved. One dead factory worker from Chicago who figured out how to fix a spring with a paperclip and died before anyone could explain to him that he'd changed aviation maintenance forever. The numbers are clean and absolute, written in maintenance records and accident reports that historians analyze decades later. Behind the numbers are human stories, bomber crews who made it home, families who got their sons back, a generation of maintainers who learned that simple solutions often work better than complex engineering, and one 20-year-old mechanic who died holding a wrench on a concrete hardstand in England, never knowing that his bent paperclip would save hundreds of lives and become legend in the aircraft maintenance community for the next 80 years.